Hey guys, I'm Georgia and welcome back to my channel for another video in my mystery series, where today we're going to be talking about the case of Ruth Ellis, a name that chances are you've never heard of before today. But Ruth was the last woman to be hanged in the UK on the 13th of July 1955. Had it not been for the fact that she was hanged, her case probably would have been swiftly forgotten about by the British public, but there's still question today as to whether she deserved what happened to her and if there was another person in the picture, somebody else who maybe should have been punished. This is a solved case obviously, but it's one that we can have an interesting discussion around, and honestly just the story of this woman's life is fascinating. How did this woman end up a murderer deemed bad enough to face the death penalty? Ruth Ellis was born Ruth Nielsen on the 9th of October 1926 in the town of Rhyl, Wales, and I'm realising as I say it out loud that I've never actually said Rhyl out loud before, but that's how I pronounce it in my head, so if that's wrong please excuse me. She was the third of 6 children. Her mother Elisabetta was half French and half Belgian, and she'd fled her home country when it was invaded by the Germans in World War I. Elisabetta arrived in the UK with nothing, so she went into service, where she soon met her husband-to-be, Arthur Nielsen. Arthur was a travelling musician from Manchester, and it seems that his birth name was actually Arthur Hornby, but he used the professional name of Arthur Nielsen and eventually changed it legally to that as well. The family had to move around often due to the nature of Arthur's work, meaning that when Ruth was still a child, the family moved to Basingstoke in Hampshire, which is where she would attend school until the age of 14. It's said that Ruth was a fairly unremarkable child. Articles describe her as pudgy and indistinguishable from other children, and she wore glasses from an early age. She always loved clothes, and it was very clear that she had big ambitions from early on. She was always very determined to make something out of her life. After just a few months of living in Basingstoke, Arthur lost his job and, absolutely devastated, he turned to drink and had to take a job as a hall porter in a mental hospital. Having his dream hit a dead end, Arthur took all of his frustrations out on his family, and all in all, it wasn't a very positive family situation to be growing up in. He was abusive. At the age of 14, Ruth left school and found work as a waitress in a local cafe, but later that year, Arthur got a job in London, and so Ruth decided to move in with him into a 2-bed flat. She soon got herself a job, first at a munitions factory and then eventually at a food processing factory. But in March 1942, she became pretty seriously ill with rheumatic fever and ended up spending 2 whole months in hospital, causing her job to come to an end. When she got out of hospital, Ruth wanted to keep herself as fit as possible, so she starts dancing, which eventually leads to a job as a photographer's assistant at the Lyceum Ballroom in the West End. After being such an unremarkable child, Ruth had very much grown into her looks. She was now 5'2" and slim with these sharp features, and she'd made the decision to dye her hair peroxide blonde, making her very much stand out. For the first time, men were really paying attention to her, and Ruth made the most of this. It wasn't long until she met and fell for a French-Canadian soldier and soon became pregnant, giving birth to her son Andy in September 1945. The only issue was the soldier was already married with children back in Canada, and although some sources say that he did pay for his son for a little while, eventually he moved back to Canada and all communication ceased. The last Ruth ever heard of him was when a bunch of red roses were delivered to her home along with a letter explaining the situation, and honestly that's probably the most respect she was ever shown by a man. And then after that, she was on her own. The world wouldn't have been particularly kind to an unmarried teen mother at this time. Actually, I still don't think it's kind to teen mothers, but Andy's care soon fell to Ruth's mother and her older sister Muriel. Ruth focused on providing for him. She wanted to ensure that she had enough money for him to have a happy childhood, and she was willing to do whatever it took to do that. So Andy went to her mother and sister, and Ruth just focused on working. So she applied for a job as a model at a place called the Camera Club and was soon posing in the nude for random men, random photographers. Some of these photographers would invite her out for drinks after their sessions, and eventually Ruth became a very popular face in the London club scene, rubbing shoulders with some of the city's most notorious names, criminals and mobsters. One of these men was a man called Maurice Connolly, known as Maury to everyone. He was just a bit of a crook, plain and simple, and found himself in ownership of multiple homes and nightclubs throughout London's West End. Essentially, he was what we would call today a pimp. Back then, he was Britain's biggest vice boss. He rented out his homes to sex workers, without a doubt taking a cut of their earnings, I'm sure. Ruth and Maury first met in 1944 at the Court Club near Grosvenor Square, and he was instantly taken with her. I mean, pound signs must be flashing before his eyes, because he very quickly realised that she would be the perfect club hostess. She was friendly, charming, charismatic, but also detached. Soon, Ruth joined his ranks and she started earning the big bucks, as well as Maury providing her with a clothing allowance, free drinks, and great networking opportunities. She was able to send huge sums of money back home for her son, which was the point of all of this. But opportunities with Maury Connolly didn't come for free. He felt like Ruth and the rest of his hostesses owed him something, and that something was, of course, sexual favours. Some sources state that he would literally blackmail them into sleeping with him, and soon Ruth became a full-service escort for the upper class. Early in 1950, she fell pregnant by one of her more regular clients and had an abortion so she could return to work quickly, but this took a toll on her mental health. She started drinking heavily each night in an attempt to hide the depression that she was dealing with. In her job, she had to be on all the time. She had to have a smile. She had to charm men into parting with their money. She couldn't afford to be solemn, so drink became her best friend. And then she met a man called George Johnson Ellis. He was married at the time with 2 sons, but this was not a happy marriage. George was also a drinker and he had a violent temper, meaning that his wife left him and took the kids. As a result, he spent a lot of time in the clubs of London and eventually met Ruth at the Court Club. He was very generous with his money and was desperate to know Ruth, so pestered her into spending time with him. One night he asked her to meet up again, and just to satiate him, she told him that she'd meet him at a club called the Hollywood, but she had no intentions to actually show. But that night, George would be attacked outside the club as he waited for Ruth after trying on with the wrong woman. He was attacked with a razor and was rushed to hospital for emergency surgery, and Ruth felt so guilty when she found out that eventually she did agree to go for dinner with him. As you might have been able to guess by the matching surnames here, the two ended up having a whirlwind romance. They met in the June of 1950, and on the 8th of November that very same year, they got married. George wasn't her dream man, but he showered her with gifts, he spoilt her, he was smart and loved music. Yeah, just like her father, he had issues with alcohol and he was violent, but she also had issues with alcohol. She needed stability and dependability, and to an extent, George provided that. The couple ended up moving to a village on the south coast near Southampton called Warsh, where George had got a job at a dental practice as a dentist. But as you can probably guess, this marriage went sour pretty quickly. George couldn't kick the alcohol addiction, and it turns out when he drank, he became very, very violent, and Ruth became the focus of these outbursts, and he beat her regularly. She would leave before returning each time. In 1951, he was fired from the dental practice, so they moved to Wales before heading down to Torquay in Cornwall, but it never got any better. And then Ruth finds out she's pregnant once again. The relationship was toxic on both sides, and during the course of her pregnancy, Ruth began to lose it a bit. George had been admitted into hospital to detox, and whilst he was there, she became convinced that he was cheating on her with the staff and other patients. On one occasion, whilst visiting him, she had to be restrained and sedated after she started ranting and raving. She was put under the care of Dr. Rees, the same psychiatrist caring for her husband, and he prescribed her drugs and sedatives that she would remain on for the rest of her life. In October 1951, Ruth gave birth to her daughter, Georgina, and soon George checked out of hospital. But he didn't head to London to be with Ruth and his daughter. He actually refused to acknowledge paternity and instead headed up north to Lancashire, where he got another job in the dental field. Less than a year later, he filed a petition for divorce on the grounds of cruelty. Believe it or not, at this point in her life, Ruth was only 25 years old with 2 children and now a divorce under her belt. She was more desperate for money than ever, so she turned back to Maury Connolly for another job, which he gives her without batting an eyelid. He even moves her into one of his many flats on Oxford Street. The club that she used to work at had now been renamed as Carol's. It was a restaurant, cabaret and dancing, open until the early hours of the morning, and as always, Ruth was very popular with all the regulars. A huge part of Carol's success came to be because of Ruth. Customers come back again and again just for her, spending their money for her. In fact, she was so successful that in 1953, Connolly gives her the job of manager at the Little Club in Knightsbridge. This was a small and intimate club with a flat above that she could live in with Andy. Andy had been returned to her care at this point, and now Georgina was being cared for by her older sister. It was also around this time that Ruth made some new friends with a group of race car drivers, including a man called David Blakely, who came into her club often. He was a good-looking guy by the standards of the time and had a very wealthy background, and so he could dedicate all of his time to his biggest passion, race cars, and was even building his own race car at the time of this story. It's said that when Ruth and David Blakely first met, they didn't really get on. Ruth found him arrogant and hard to converse with, but soon their attraction to one another became undeniable. David Moffat Drummond Blakely had been born in Sheffield on the 17th of June 1929, the youngest of 4 children to Dr. John and Annie Blakely. When he was just 5, his dad was arrested and charged with the murder of a woman called Phyllis Statton, who it seems that he'd had an affair with and gotten pregnant. He prescribed her drugs to abort the pregnancy and she ended up dying of septicemia. Ultimately, the case against Dr. John Blakely was dismissed and he went on with his life as if nothing had happened, except for the fact that his wife divorced him. She remarried in 1941 to Humphrey Wyndham Cook, a very rich businessman and one of the best racing car drivers in Britain at this time. The couple and all the children moved to London before David was sent off to boarding school in Shrewsbury. It's said that David was never a particularly bright student. It was clear from early on that literally the only thing he cared about in life was race cars. He didn't have the time or the attention span for anything else. He eventually finished school, served in the British Army, and soon found work at the Hyde Park Hotel in London, which paid pretty well, when he turned up for his shifts, that was. David was a very social person. He had a tight group of friends, all of whom he would go and visit the clubs with and attend races with. Over the years he had many lovers, but never really anyone serious until he met Linda Dawson, an heiress of a wealthy manufacturer. David was enamoured with Linda, but not enough that he didn't cheat on her fairly often. Eventually he was fired from his job at the hotel, but it doesn't really seem like that was much of an interruption to his life, so he gets a new job at a manufacturer in Buckinghamshire, but he's still spending the majority of his spare time in London in the clubs, and eventually his path crosses with Ruth's. Their love affair is quick, and soon he's practically living in the flat above the club with Ruth and Andy. But confusingly, just a number of weeks later, David's engagement to Linda is announced in the London Times. Sadly for Ruth, David was fairly similar to the rest of the men in her life. He was said to be an alcoholic with a violent streak. Their entire relationship was passionate and substance-fueled, backed up by many witnesses. Soon, once again, Ruth found herself pregnant and unable to commit to raising another child, she had her second abortion. In all the turbulence of her relationship with David, Ruth meets another man called Desmond Cousin, who was also part of the racing club that David was a part of. Ruth was completely obsessed with David. He was tall, dark and handsome. Despite his violence, he excited her and she couldn't seem to be able to tear herself away from him. Desmond was older. He was 32 years old, he was more secure and provided a level of comfort that Ruth so craved in her life. He was an accountant and a director of the family business. He also had his own business and, just like David, was an avid racing enthusiast. He was never a professional driver, but he loved it, and Desmond would drive around London in his fancy cars. He was described by people who knew him as a solitary man, always polite, who never used foul language and did not belong in the circles in which he moved. Desmond and Ruth got on, but it was no secret that he was hopelessly in love with her, while she only really craved the attention of David Blakely. Desmond would have been jealous of this man, who was almost a decade younger than him, more handsome, wealthy beyond reason, and had all the attention of the woman that he loved. Desmond was just a bit boring. At this same time, around May 1954, George, Ruth's ex-husband, comes back to London and takes their 3-year-old daughter Georgina back up to Lancashire where he was living, with the intention of adopting her out. Although at this point he'd requested a divorce 2 years ago, Ruth had put off signing anything, so she was technically still married. George wanted the divorce, it was all very bitter. And then the final piece of the puzzle that is this story comes in the form of a man called Ant Findlater. He was very good friends with David, best friends, and the two had been working on building a race car together for quite a long time. Ant Findlater was married to Carol Findlater, and there was somewhat of an interesting past there, an interesting dynamic. Ant and David had been friends for many years after having met through the racing world, but David had become kind of obsessed with the idea of running off with Carol, Ant's wife. Apparently she was miles out of David's league, but somehow he managed to convince her that this was a very good idea. So one day she comes home to pack her bags and run away with David, but Ant managed to convince her to stay. Ant knew that she'd intended to run away with David, his best friend, but somehow their friendship managed to survive, and the three of them remained the best of friends. It was very convoluted. But now David was seeing Ruth and other people as well, I'm sure, and the waters were getting even muddier. Ruth wasn't stupid. She knew all about David's past with Carol, and she was jealous of it. And she was pretty sure that Carol and Anne had been warning David off her. He'd started recently acting even colder than usual, and she was desperate for his attention. You've got this woman who's just obsessed with this one man, who's the same as every other man in her life, and she can't seem to shake it, but he's just sort of giving her the cold shoulder. He'd show her attention when he wanted to, and then he'd withdraw. And on top of all of this, Little Club was struggling. Ruth wasn't earning any money, and I'm sure she would have been in a lot of trouble with Maury Connolly if she let things get south. David was one of her best customers and ran up these enormous tabs, but he would never pay them and she couldn't make him. Eventually, she was fired or she quit, depending on what you want to believe. Ruth was now out of a job, and seeing as she lived in the flat above the club, she was also homeless. Andy had been at boarding school, but he was due back soon and she needed somewhere to live. So good old trusty Desmond Cusson comes through for her and lets her move into his flat. Unknowingly by this point, Ruth had fallen pregnant with David's baby again, but their relationship was becoming increasingly more violent and they were never faithful to one another. David was furious that Ruth moved in with Desmond, but he refused to provide a better life for her. She didn't have another choice. She told him that her and Desmond were friends only, she wouldn't sleep with him, but she also never told Desmond when she was going out for the night to stay with David in a local hotel. In January 1955, her divorce from George finally comes through, and I'm pretty sure around this point as well, David's relationship with Linda was dead and gone. On February 6th, 1955, Desmond was away and David headed over to the flat to spend some time with Ruth. Soon he was calling some friends and telling them that Ruth had tried to stab him. When these friends arrived, they found Ruth with a black eye, covered head to toe in bruises and limping, whilst David also had a black eye and was limping. She was holding David's car keys ransom and refused to let him leave, and when he eventually did leave, she didn't hear from him for a whole day. Ruth was getting more and more paranoid by the day, and so she travels around London in search of all the women David had mentioned to her in the past, convinced that he was cheating on her with one of them. Around this time, the Findlaters had also gotten a new nanny, and with the amount of time David spent around their house, Ruth became convinced that he was cheating on her with the nanny, as well as pretty much every other woman he came into contact with. Ruth was overcome with jealousy, but so was David, who was unable to get over the fact that she now lived with Desmond. So the obvious answer was that they needed to move into a place of their own, and they borrowed money from Desmond to do so. Poor Desmond, hopelessly in love and just being taken along for the ride. David and Ruth rented a flat together in Kensington under the names Mr. and Mrs. Ellis, but of course that didn't fix any of their issues. In just days, they were arguing about David's unfaithfulness once again. So Ruth turned back to Desmond again. Anyone else getting whiplash? In March 1955, Ruth miscarries after they get into another fight and David punches her in the stomach, and she receives little sympathy from anyone because nobody really believed the baby was David's. Ruth was beginning to reach her limits. At the beginning of April, David, Ruth and Ant drove up north to a race meeting where David intended to race his car, but it broke down during the practice lap. Somehow that became Ruth's fault. After another weekend of arguments, the couple returned to London. For this doomed couple, love and hate were synonymous. They couldn't stand to be around each other, they hated each other, but they also didn't know how to function without the other. They couldn't be torn apart, and Ruth knew it. As long as David was around, she was never going to be able to get her life back on track. She wanted a real relationship, she wanted love, and she wanted it with David, but that was never going to happen. They continue in the same cycle until Easter weekend, beginning Friday 8th of April. David left early that morning, saying he had a meeting with Ant and would be home early. He promised Ruth that he wouldn't be going round to the Findlaters' home because she still didn't trust Carol. But at 9:30 p.m. that night, David still hadn't returned home, so Ruth calls the Findlaters. The nanny picks up and says David isn't there, but then she calls back again, and this time Ant answers, also saying David wasn't there. But she knew he was. Ruth kept calling and calling the phone to the point where they had to take the phone off the hook. By midnight, Ruth could stand it no longer. She called Desmond and asked him to give her a lift to the Findlaters' home, to which he obviously immediately obliged. Spotting David's car out front, she hammered on the door, but nobody answered. So then she destroyed his car, smashing the windows, causing a neighbour to call the police, who arrived and eventually calmed Ruth down. Eventually the police left, but Ruth still wanted to see David. He was hidden away, but she knew he was in that house. She ended up hiding in the doorway of a house down the road and sure enough watched David as he left the house about 10 a.m. that next morning with Ant. In her mind, he must have been having an affair with the nanny. There was no other explanation. She wasn't exactly the most rational of people. That day, the Saturday, David still doesn't come home. She stalks him, catching sight of him multiple times over the next 24 hours, but he refused to have any contact with her. Desmond eventually persuades her to go home, but she doesn't sleep. She stays up all night on a cocktail of drink and drugs, and in her haze, she decides what needs to be done. David needs to die. David was still at the Findlaters' house, of course, and at 8:45 p.m. on Sunday the 10th of April, Carol runs out of cigarettes, so David agrees to go down to the local pub, the Magdala, to pick them up, along with their friend Clive Gunnell. As David left to drive down to the pub, little did he know that Ruth was outside watching. She would later say that she got a taxi to the area that night. She waited outside the Magdala for him to reappear, and when he did so at 9:30 p.m, she shouted for his attention. He either didn't hear her or ignored her, so she pulls a gun out of her handbag, a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver, and shot him. The first bullet missed and he tried to run, but the second bullet hit and he collapsed immediately. Ruth then walked up to where he was lying and shot him 3 more times, the last at point-blank range into his left shoulder. The last shot she made was into the pavement. The bullet ricocheted off and injured a woman who's walking out of the pub with her husband. The bullet shot through the base of this woman's thumb and shattered it. Then Ruth turned to Clive, who David had been with, and said, "Will you call the police, Clive?" There was actually already a police officer, PC Alan Thompson, having a drink inside the pub at the time, and he rushed outside to see what was going on. He walked up to Ruth, who also said to him, "Will you call the police?" He replied, "I am the police," as he removed the gun from her hands. She asked if he'd arrest her, which he did. Minutes later, more police arrived along with an ambulance, and David was rushed to hospital but was pronounced dead on arrival. Ruth was taken to the local station where she made a statement and fully confessed to what she'd done. At 12:30 p.m. the next day, she was officially charged with murder, appearing at Hampstead Magistrates Court the next day before being taken to Holloway Prison to await her trial. The trial will begin on Monday, June 20th, 1955 at the Old Bailey. There was no doubt that she was guilty of the crime she'd been accused of. She never tried to pretend that she hadn't been guilty of the murder of David Blakely, and the trial went as such. But she did actually put in a plea of not guilty, probably just so her story could be heard. She told her tale and even defended him at some point, saying that he only hit me with his fists or hands and that she just bruised very easily. She spoke of the punch that may have caused a miscarriage and how she was sure that the violators and David had been conspiring against her. When asked what her intention was when she aimed the gun at David that night, she replied simply, "It is obvious that when I shot him, I intended to kill him." Her defence tried to come up with a story that Ruth was overtaken by jealousy, that she wasn't thinking properly when she shot David. They said no way was it premeditated murder, that it was the slightly lesser charge of manslaughter, but the judge ruled against this. Ruth was examined twice for any sign of mental illness, but no sign of insanity was found. After only a day and a half of trial, the jury retired to come to a verdict, and after just 23 minutes came back with a guilty verdict. And then the judge handed down the mandatory death sentence, committing her to a lawful prison and thence to a place of execution, and that there you be hanged by the neck until you be dead. From here, Ruth Ellis would only have 24 more days to live. But people weren't about to let her go without a fight. The general public were actually shocked that she'd been given the death penalty, something which was already falling out of favour with the country as a whole. It seemed excessive. 50,000 people signed a petition asking for mercy for Ruth Ellis, but the Home Secretary refused to bend on the sentence. There was a general election on the 24th of May that year. The Conservative Party had only just held on to their seat. Had the Labour Party won, chances are Ruth would have been spared. With the amount of the public speaking out against the death penalty in recent years, the Conservative British government refused to be seen as weak and giving in to the demands. They'd only just been re-elected for a reason. In fact, they probably just became more determined to see it through when the petition came in. In cases of murder at this time, the death sentence was actually mandatory, and even the judge who handed down the sentence sent a letter to the Home Secretary recommending a reprieve, as the crime was to be considered a crime of passion, a crime passionnel, but he was refused. Ruth's solicitor also sent a 7-page letter setting out grounds for the reprieve, but nothing worked. She was to die, and that was that. But Ruth herself remained silent, only saying to her mother that she didn't want a reprieve. She knew she had to pay for what she'd done. Her execution date was set for the 13th of July 1955. She woke up and wrote a number of farewell letters to her loved ones, including one to her solicitor. It's said that after dealing with Ruth's case, he lost all faith in the justice system and he never practiced law again. She wrote a letter to David's mother in which she said that she had always loved David and would die loving him. It was 9 AM when Albert Pierrepoint, the executioner, entered the cell Ruth was about to die in. She was just 28 years old. He placed a white hood over her head and secured the noose. He then pulled the lever and Ruth Ellis died. Her autopsy showed that she had died of injuries to the central nervous system. She had a fractured dislocation of the spine and separation of the spinal cord. She was the final woman to be hanged in England and was buried in an unmarked grave in the grounds of the prison. Years later, Andy, Ruth's son, got her remains exhumed and reburied in the churchyard of St Mary's Church in Amersham, Buckingham, under the name of Ruth Hornby, which was her father's original surname. Sadly, Andy would destroy the headstone in 1982, shortly before he ended up committing suicide. This entire case is a tragedy beginning to end. This case caused widespread controversy at the time. You might think we just look back on it now through a 2022 lens and see what could have been done differently, but no, it was hugely controversial at the time as well, as you might have guessed by the fact that 50,000 people signed a petition for Ruth's clemency. Although the case did seem very cut and dry, a lot of people think that it was never investigated properly. In fact, a lot of people who visited her in the days leading up to her execution seemed to think that she was hiding something or protecting someone. The main question was, how did Ruth get her hands on a gun? She told police that she'd got it 3 years earlier for a drinking debt at the club, and of course there's no way to confirm or deny that. But none of Ruth's friends or family ever say she mentioned anything about a gun and never saw one in her home, even when helping her move house. Andy would later say that he had seen Desmond Cusson clean the gun and give it to Ruth when she was with his mother that Sunday afternoon, but no one ever followed up on this. In fact, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest that this gun did belong to Desmond. In the weeks before all this happened, Ruth had even been taking French lessons in an attempt to impress David, which Desmond of course had been paying for, and the French tutor said that he once saw 2 handguns in a drawer at Desmond's flat. And there's also a question as to how Ruth was able to fire effectively at a moving target, as David was literally running away from her. She was a small, petite woman, and the recoil from this gun would have hit her hard. If she'd never shot a gun before, which is what she said, how did she hit her target? Was it just luck? Well, some sources say that Desmond had previously taken her into the woods and shown her how to effectively fire a gun. There's good evidence that the gun was in fact Desmond's. Home Office documents released in 1999 revealed that on the morning of her death, Ruth made a confession to a solicitor that she was not this lone, cold-blooded killer that she seemed to be. She said that Desmond had handed her the gun and driven her there. Although it is an important detail to note that the officer in the room who was also there had said that she had asked Desmond for the gun. He hadn't given it to her, she had asked for it, which is an important distinction. One journalist, Duncan Webb, would later claim that Ruth had made a pact with Desmond. If he provided her with a gun and transported her to Hampstead Heath that night, she would never reveal his name and he would have to financially safeguard Andy's future. But even if Desmond was behind the scenes pulling some strings, Ruth was still the one who pulled the trigger. How much can Desmond actually be blamed for? After Ruth made this confession that morning, the solicitor got the news out and Scotland Yard were ordered to search for Desmond, but he wasn't at home, so they gave up after just an hour of searching. 2 decades later, a friend of Desmond wrote to Scotland Yard admitting that he had concealed from the jury that Desmond had driven Ruth to Hampstead and provided her with a gun and goaded her into shooting David to remove a love rival from the scene. But this is where it's a bit of a grey area, particularly in 1955 law. Does all of this make Desmond guilty of anything? Can you blame Desmond for just telling Ruth to kill David? Ruth made the decision to do so, she pulled the trigger. But Desmond may well have played a bigger part in David's death than history has us believe. He was vying for Ruth's attention, she was playing him and David against each other, there's no doubt about that. Maybe he'd also had enough of the situation and he saw a way out. There's no doubt he wouldn't have been much of a fan of David and he did want Ruth for himself. But Desmond wasn't a stupid man, he would have known the consequences of Ruth killing David. He lost her for good after this. But do we think Ruth deserved to die for her crime? I personally don't think so, but then again I am staunchly against the death penalty in general, so perhaps I'm biased. But let's look at this methodically. There's little evidence to suggest that Ruth was a danger to the general public. Had she been given a life sentence and say been released on parole after a decade, chances are she wouldn't have reoffended. There were a lot of things that led to the tragic ending here. The chances of these same things happening again would have been slim. Not impossible, but slim. She never showed violence towards anyone apart from David when they were having these big rows. And this was a highly abusive relationship, both mentally and physically. It was known even before David got with Ruth that he had a propensity towards violence, especially when it came to women, especially when he drank. That's a fact backed up by many friends and family. Ruth had been provoked after years of mistrust and violence from men, which can, under certain circumstances, become a legal defence. And Ruth did show remorse, there's no denying that. A lengthy prison sentence here was definitely justified, there's no doubt about that, but the death sentence, that remains questionable. There's almost no doubt that if this same case was presented to a jury today, if all of the evidence was shown, she would likely be found guilty of manslaughter, but not murder. Although at trial doctors did examine Ruth for any sign of mental illness, her defence didn't call her own doctor up to the witness stand, Dr. Reese, whose care she'd remained under since he first prescribed her with some drugs when she was still married to George. He could have attested to her state of mind, her history in relationships, and the fact that she had been legally prescribed sedatives. Combined with alcohol, that could have made her incapable of rational behaviour at the time she killed David. And the alcohol she was known to drink was something called Pernod, a French aperitif that was colloquially known as lunatic soup for how strong and intoxicating it was. Although the police noted that she seemed sober when she was at the police station, I wonder exactly how true that was, as many sources say that she was a full-blown alcoholic by this point in her life. But this was 1950s England. Ruth was a divorcee with loose sexual morals, she was a drunk, she had a child out of wedlock as a teenager. There would have been much less sympathy for her back then than there generally would be now. Some think that the reason the Home Office doubled down her execution was to prove a point. If you act like Ruth Ellis, look what could happen to you. If they let her off the execution, they'd be seen to be giving sympathy to a sexually promiscuous woman, and this was the Conservative Party after all. It was law that if you're found guilty of murder, particularly by firearm, you would be given the mandatory death penalty. But there had been many cases in the years leading up to this where reprieves had been granted, given to women and men alike for very similar crimes. I do think it was because this case received so much attention that the government couldn't be seen as doubling down. If it hadn't been in all the newspapers, then maybe Ruth could have survived. As Judith Nelman wrote in a 1998 History Today article, while male villainy was dismissed as an unfortunate regression, the same sort of behaviour in females, particularly when it was directed at males, was condemned as a hideous perversion. Seems apt here, doesn't it? Ruth, at the hands of male violence for years, both physical and mental, snaps, and both her and David pay the ultimate price. Murder is technically committed by somebody of sound mind and discretion. Was Ruth really either of those things? In the years to come, change did happen. Her story led to the Homicide Act of 1957, which limited the types of murder that were considered capital and introduced the defence of diminished responsibility. Although, ironically, neither of these would have helped in Ruth's case. The last executions in the UK were also by hanging and took place in 1964, for capital punishment was suspended for murder the next year. Although the death penalty did remain a legally defined punishment for certain offences like treason until 1998, it was never used after 1964. Ruth's case really made the public fight back. It brought the issue to the forefront of people's minds in a way it wasn't necessarily before. But it's difficult because she was punished in accordance with the laws at the time. It wasn't particularly over the top for her and only her. Anyone in this situation would have been executed. But the problem is there are nuances to every case that require different lenses. This was a battered woman dealing with another alcoholic, violent boyfriend after every other male relationship in her life had also ended the same way: alcoholism and domestic violence. Her father, her husband, David, no doubt other men along the way too. Maybe she really couldn't see a light at the end of the tunnel. Some people think that Ruth intended to die all along, that the reason she refused to fight for reprieve herself is that she knew when she killed David what the punishment would be. It was some sort of contrived murder-suicide. Maybe she intended to kill herself outside the pub that night but bottled it at the last moment. She didn't want to spend her life in prison. Perhaps she thought if her and David were both dead, they would live together forever in the afterlife. We don't know. Muriel, Ruth's older sister, fought for years to get Ruth's murder conviction quashed and changed to a verdict of manslaughter on the grounds of provocation and/or diminished responsibility. She said that Ruth suffered battered woman syndrome. However, 3 separate judges have said that the appeal is without merit and that she was properly convicted of murder as the law stood at the time. It wasn't until the 1990s that the law was softened on the defence of provocation, meaning that it could be used in cases of domestic violence. Muriel said that her father had raped her when she was 14, fathering a child who was raised as her brother, and that their father also abused Ruth as well. But of course, Ruth is no longer here to confirm or deny that. All of this was back in 2003 when Muriel was 83 years old, and although I couldn't find confirmation anywhere, I will assume that Muriel has since died. George Ellis, Ruth's husband, also died of suicide 3 years after Ruth died, and Georgina died in the early 2000s, but she was survived by 6 children. I don't know if there's anyone left fighting for Ruth anymore, or if anyone even should be. This is a really tricky case because you can't justify murder. There's no justification for murder. Unless in some cases, maybe there is a justification. I'm really interested to hear what you guys think in the comments of this one. I personally don't think Ruth deserved to die for her crimes, but then again, I don't believe in the death penalty for anyone in any case. But I'll be very intrigued to know what you guys think, so please let me know. Thank you so much for tuning in this week, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.